Think about this for a second. What if every single piece of employee feedback was like a puzzle piece? On its own, it's just this tiny fragment. But when you put them all together, bam, you get the full, honest picture of your organization's health. So today, we're going to explore exactly how companies are solving that puzzle and finally learning to listen to the real voice of their workforce. I mean, it's a massive question for any leader, right? Just imagine having those unfiltered, totally honest thoughts from every single corner of your company. It would be like having a superpower, for sure. Well, that's exactly the problem that HR sentiment analysis is designed to solve. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the core problem, the feedback puzzle. Then we'll get into the art of asking the right questions. After that, we'll see how technology unlocks all that written feedback. Then, how all that data turns into real action. And finally, we'll wrap it up with an awesome case study to see it all in motion. All right, first up, let's talk about this feedback puzzle. It's really important to understand just how big of a challenge this can be. So just imagine you're running a company with, say, hundreds, maybe even thousands of employees, trying to get a real pulse on things like morale or engagement or burnout. It can feel completely impossible. It's kind of like trying to hear one single conversation in the middle of a massive roaring stadium. All the voices are there, but it's just noise. And that is exactly where modern analytics steps in. It's like this super powerful filter that just cuts right through all that stadium noise. It takes all those individual opinions, all those frustrations, and it organizes them into one clear, coherent picture of what's actually going on. But here's the thing. To get that clear picture, you've got to start with the right data. And getting the right data, well, that all comes down to what we're calling the art of the ask. This isn't just about randomly throwing some questions out there and hoping for the best. Nope. There's a whole science behind it, and it's called psychometrics. It's all about carefully, scientifically crafting questions that don't have any bias and that actually measure what you're trying to measure, whether that's engagement or inclusion or even stress levels. And you can see the difference so clearly right here. Asking something vague like, "Are you happy at work?" I mean, what does happy even mean, right? It's useless. But asking a specific question like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how manageable is your workload? Now we're talking. That gives you concrete, comparable data that you can actually do something with. So this science gets applied to all kinds of specialized surveys. You can't just use one big survey to measure everything. It doesn't work like that. Instead, you have things like engagement surveys to check motivation, DEI surveys for fairness and belonging, and culture surveys to see if everyone's on the same page with company values. Each one is a specific tool for a specific job. Okay, so those rating scales and numbers, they give you the what, but the real juicy stuff, the why behind the numbers, that's almost always hidden in the written comments. And that brings us to our next section, how we unlock all that written feedback. Seriously, those open-ended comments, that's where you find the real gold. It's the story behind the statistics. But let's be real, who has time to read thousands of them? It's just not possible for a person. And that's where technology, specifically something called natural language processing, or NLP, comes in to do all the heavy lifting for us. So the way it works is actually pretty cool and super logical. First, the system just sucks in all the text feedback. Then it analyzes the language, looking at tone and key phrases. Next, it starts grouping comments into big themes, like workload or management. And finally, it gives each theme a sentiment score. Is it positive, negative, or neutral? It's pretty amazing. It's how a machine basically learns to understand nuance. So, take a look at this. This is a perfect example of that raw, honest feedback you get. Now, by itself, this is just one person's experience, right? But what happens when the system finds hundreds or maybe even thousands of comments that are saying pretty much the same thing? All of a sudden, that's not just one voice. That is a very powerful signal. Okay, so remember that comment we just saw? This is what the NLP system does with it. It breaks it down, it identifies the key themes, in this case, workload and communication, and it tags the overall sentiment as negative. Now just picture that same process happening, but scaled across thousands of comments, all in an instant. That's how you get a data-driven map of your company's biggest challenges. So having this map of your challenges is amazing. But then comes the so what question. What do you actually do with it? And that's probably the most important part of this whole thing, which brings us to our next section, turning data into action. And I really can't stress this enough. This is the most critical step. I mean, you can have the most beautiful dashboard in the world full of amazing data, but if it doesn't lead to actual change, it's completely useless. The whole point of this entire process is to give leaders the clarity they need to make smart, targeted improvements.
Right, and this isn't a one-shot deal either. The best companies, they build a real rhythm around this. It's a continuous cycle. They'll gather feedback in the first quarter, develop their action plans in the second, implement the changes in the third, and then, and this part is crucial, they measure the impact in the fourth quarter to see what actually worked. And then the whole cycle just starts over again.
And that last step, the measuring part, that makes all the difference. In fact, get this, when action plans have clear, measurable goals, their chance of actually succeeding can jump by a whopping 70%. That's the difference between just making a vague promise and having a real, concrete plan. Okay, so for our final section, let's see how all these pieces, the smart survey questions, the fancy NLP, the action plans, let's see how it all comes together in a real-world scenario. All right, so here's the setup. We have a large healthcare system, and they are struggling big time. They have high staff turnover, morale is in the basement. I mean, they knew they had a problem, but they just couldn't pinpoint the exact why. They had no idea where to even start fixing things. So they launched one of these sentiment analysis surveys, and wow, the results came back crystal clear. The data immediately pointed to the biggest issues. A full 40% of the negative feedback was about burnout. Another 30% was about poor communication. All of a sudden, the puzzle pieces just started snapping into place. And with that kind of clarity, they could finally stop guessing and start taking real action. And they didn't just do some generic wellness program either. Nope. They implemented specific, data-driven fixes. They totally overhauled their scheduling protocols to tackle burnout head-on, and they rolled out mandatory training for managers to improve communication. Really targeted stuff. And here's the payoff. Just look at that shift. 1 year after putting that plan in place, staff satisfaction shot up from 45% all the way to 75%. That right there is the power of listening at scale and then acting with precision. It's so much more than a number on a chart. That represents a fundamentally better, healthier place to work. So all of this leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. We're moving away from the world of the once-a-year survey. We're entering an era of constant, instant feedback. The technology is just getting faster and faster. So the real question for the future isn't just, are you listening anymore? It's how fast can you adapt? And honestly, the entire future of work might just depend on that answer.